Welcome to the session on women and prisoners of war. It's interesting to see that the organizers put women and prisoners of war together in the same category as captives of a kind. There are 4 papers, and we'll take them in the order in which they've been listed here. The first speaker will be Gunda Bhatt-Skalmani, who will speak on female labor in agriculture during the war. She'll be followed by Norva Robinson, Adapting Arab World War I and the development of women's and Arab nationalism. Then we'll have Matthias Egger speaking on humanitarian duty or political calculation on the Habsburg Empire's relief effort. And then lastly, Shemik Chelik, who will be speaking on barbarism and discourses of the Ottoman Empire on prisoners. And very nice panel this because I think there are leads that are cross-cutting and intersect, and I'm sure this will be a very stimulating session. Okay, thanks very much. Good.
Well, thank you, Bill, for introducing, and my thanks also goes to the organizer for inviting me. I had the hope that I would get in contact with a lot of Turkish fellows in order to learn more about the hinterland situation of women in the Ottoman Empire. We'll see how this develops. So my paper is dealing with the hinterland situation in the war, and I'm dealing with a specific segment of the women population, namely the women living in the countryside. I will start with a kind of thesis or statement, namely that women in the countryside are the blind spot of gender and female history dealing with World War I. I'm not going into detail with these quotations as they're German, although I have translated it. And I will tell you the points I'm doing right now. We'll talk about why I consider this topic a relevant topic. I will talk then about some economic data of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy. I will briefly dive into the anthropological reconstruction of the interrelation of females and men work in the agriculture. I will present my sources and then some observations on the case study of Tarot. So why do I find that important, this topic, when we look into the development of women's and gender history in the German-speaking orbit, and I think, I know that this holds also true for the English-speaking context. When the first studies started, and when they were concentrating on women's work, there was a specific understanding of the term of women's work. Namely, by women's work, the early studies understood just and only work done by women outside the private household, namely in factories or in other working conditions, working contexts. So this is a very narrow understanding of women's work. And in the second stage of gender and female history, one realized that when understanding women's work in this narrow sense, one only was repeating or copying the understanding of the contemporaries as they did not consider as work what women were doing in the household. According to middle class pattern, this was considered as work done by sheer love. It was, so to speak, their biological destination to do so. So the second stage of the development of gender history focused then more on work done by women in general, by that including what women were doing also in the household. Now when it comes to the start of World War I, this means that women were mobilized in general, women's work was mobilized in general, and whatever they were doing also connected with household activities was seen as a mobilization of their working force for the war aims. That meant, to be more concrete, that for when girls were learning how to knit in schools, they had to knit socks to be sent to the troops, something which in German was called the Liebesgabenwerk or the love work. And when we regard the work done by women in the private household in order to keep the private household as a productive unit, this was also considered to be a contribution to the entire economic situation as such. Now, when we look So when we look to the statistics data, we do see that the majority of women in the Austro-Hungarian context were around 1910, because this is where the data comes from, the census of 1910. The majority of the women was still working in an agricultural context. Only where you see the red dots and the orange dots, the majority of people in general, but we can also conclude the women here were turning over more and more to industrial obligation and industrial work. Where you do have the light yellow color, there people were working in agriculture and partly also in craftsman situation. Now, when we conclude the situation of women's and gender history, we must say that it is a striking phenomenon that all the publications done so far concentrate on women living and working in an urban area. And I would like to show you how the statistical situation was, because when we look to some numbers of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy, we see that from a rough population of, let's say, 50 million people, in an economic active age group, there were, roughly speaking, 17 million people, men and women brought together. And when we look to in what kind of sectors they were working, we will see that even here the agriculture and forestry is still the dominant sector. If we narrow that down to women's occupations, when we look to those groups working in the industry, only 1.8 million women were working in the industry. And this did not substantially change in the course of World War I. Austria, the Austrian half of the monarchy at this point does show the same phenomena like other European countries during the war, namely the fact that women did shift from one industrial branch to the other branch, but not a large number of women was drafted newly into the industrial work sector. So this is the reason why I think one should look more to the women in the countryside, as they more or less are not covered so far. And when we look to where people were living in the time before the war, we must say that the majority of the people still was living on the countryside. To give you some figures, when we look to villages which are below 500 inhabitants or 2,000 inhabitants, we can go even to bigger villages up to 5,000 inhabitants. The majority is living in these small villages, whereas there are more or less marginal, to say in a provocative form, people living in big cities are a marginal phenomenon. With that, I want to contrast all the euphoria when dealing with Vienna at the turn of the century, Vienna of the century. These are stories of a metropolis, but not of the rest of the country. So, this slide is only showing what I've said here with reference to the statistics. You see here in different colored dots the cities, and the cities as a phenomenon do hold much more true for the Bohemian part. Certainly you do see Vienna, you do see Budapest or Prague. But when we come then to my case study, when we come to Tyrol, the cities and women living in the cities are really the exception. Okay, now when we come now to the case study of Tyrol, we must say there are some specific patterns, namely that Tyrol did have a high number of small-scale agricultural units. That means 74% of all the entire farms were small-scale farms on which only members of the families were working. So this means that the number of female servants which were not members of the family in Tyrol are not very high, and this is a sharp contrast when we go to other crownlands of the Austrian Alps. If we go, for instance, to Styria or to Upper Austria, Lower Austria. Okay, now with the next slide, I want to show you why it is also interestingly to look into the summer of 1914, because when we put together the entire workforce of the agricultural sector in Tyrol, it's roughly speaking 250, and 1/3 of this entire workforce were the men who were drafted immediately by the end of July, beginning of August 1914. So what did that mean if 1/3 of the entire working force was drafted? In order to understand that, we have to take a close look into the subtle equilibrium of working in the agriculture. Because what we know and what we learn from anthropologists is that working on a farm did mean that steps of within the working procedure done by women and steps within a working procedure done by men were intertwined heavily. For instance, to give you one example, when you think to cattle breeding, men were sowing the grass, but women had to put that into haystacks, and we could go on in all the detailed steps of agricultural procedures, and you could see then that steps of women's work were intertwined with steps of men's work. So when 1/3 of the working force was drafted in July, and many more to come in the next years of the war, this meant that this subtle intertwined cooperation was split and was cut drastically. Okay, next question, what kind of documents do we have if we think to war experience of women? And normally historians, and this is why I think most of the general women historians have concentrated on the urban area, because in the urban area we do have ego documents, in the urban area we do already have clubs and federations of women, and these are exactly the documents which we do not have when it comes to women in the agricultural scene. What we do have, though, are documents like the war correspondence. We do have the last picture taken before the men were drafted to the front. We have pictures taken when they did already have a prisoner of war, for instance here. But these pictures don't tell us a lot about the working procedure, and pictures like this where you see women and just women working in the small summer farms high above in the Alps are very, very rare. So we have to turn to other documents, and these are named different discourses in these newspapers, and I call that a discourse from above and a discourse from below. In the discourse from above, the editor, so to speak, wants, on behalf of the state, to mobilize the women, and they start to write how important the work of women is and how great the women are in doing all the man's obligation. In the discourse from below, this is more the end part of the newspapers where men used to write letters to the editor. All of a sudden, from 1914 onwards, we find now letters written by women to the editor, which sharply contrast this discourse from above, because women say, I don't have a maid servant anymore, I have 2 elderly people at home, I have 3 kids, and I have 17 cattle, and I simply can't do the work. And I think this is important to stress this more, because when we deal with the economic situation in the Austrian monarchy, one hears a lot about the statistical decline in all kind of production, but one never looks carefully to the change in the workforce. It was quite clear that women who were used, that men were sowing the grass, or that men were working in the woods, they couldn't replace everything. From another document, namely from the war correspondence, we know that women were not in the full context writing their men what they had to do, but there did interchange in these war correspondence with their husbands how to fulfill the new obligations if there was a cow to be sold. And on the other hand, for instance, men wrote back from the front, don't be concerned about the production in general, just do that you have enough to survive. And I think this also should be, these kind of sources should be used more in order to explain why there was such a drastic decline of the production. Now, in order to conclude, I would say whenever we talk about war brings a disorder in the gender relation and in the gender roles, we also can observe this for the agricultural sector with our case study we did on Tyrone, and I think one would find the same for other parts too. There is a limit with the documentaries, with the sources which we have, because it's a striking point that the newspapers have these 2 contrasting discourse until 1916, beginning of 1917, then there is an end. Censorship has reached also the segment letters to the editors. And when it comes to the end of the war, like in other parts of the society, also in the agricultural population, everybody seemed to be happy to return back to normalcy and to normal circumstances, and the women did hand over the entire obligation for the farmhouse back to the men, and I think it was important to them after the traumatic experiences which they had had on the battlefields to be fully regarded in their role as man and head of the family. Thank you for your
Thank you very much, Gunda. We'll now move on to